My name is Maggie Klein. I welcome you to this Manor Club Zoom meeting. This is one in a series of our Zoom meetings. Our next one will be with historian Blake Bell, speaking about the ghosts of Pelham. And that meeting will be on Monday, October 26th. Like this one, you will send an email to the Manor Club of Pelham at gmail.com and you will get the access codes for the meeting. Tonight, our guest speaker is Beth Fouhy, who is a senior political correspondent at NBC News and MSNBC. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
Thanks very much, Maggie, and thanks to all of you guys for coming. I think I've done these in election years in the past in person at the Manor Club, and I wish we could all be doing the same thing and being in the same room together to have this conversation, but since we can't, I really appreciate you all jumping on Zoom and joining us this way. So I'm going to show a little slide presentation to get us going, and then we're going to have plenty of time for questions. So hold those to the end. Hopefully the gods of technology will work for us, and I will get my slideshow going here. Can you guys see this?
Yes. Yes. I'm the only one.
Okay.
They are all muted.
Okay. So let's start, before we get to our present day, let's kind of take a little visit back to the beginning of the year, pre-pandemic, to look at what the political outlook seemed to be back in February of 2020. And as you guys might recall, President Trump had been impeached by the House in December. And it was, of course, a very partisan vote. And we predicted the same thing would happen in the Senate. And in fact, it did. The Republican-controlled Senate acquitted President Trump of charges that he had unfairly or illegally pressured Ukraine to do a political favor for him in exchange for buying arms. So he emerged victorious. His polling numbers went up. Meanwhile, the Democrats looked like they were in complete chaos. The Democratic primary was underway, and the first contest, which was the Iowa caucuses, basically devolved into chaos with no clear winner. The state didn't appear to know how to count its votes. Vice President Biden, who is now the Democratic nominee for president, placed fourth in Iowa. Looked like he was sort of on his last legs. Bernie Sanders, the very left-leaning Democratic socialist, emerged victorious ultimately, and he seemed to be on a march toward the nomination. That, of course, ended on February 29th when Joe Biden won the South Carolina primary, which essentially set him on his path to win the nomination. But it still looked bleak for Democrats back then. President Trump had come out of this impeachment looking victorious. The unemployment rate in February was 3.5%, and the Democrats just looked pretty hapless and pretty disorganized. But then life would change. We had coronavirus coming along that was going to take over our country, but we didn't realize that quite at the time. We just started to get little glimpses of it. The first confirmed death of coronavirus happened in Washington State in February 29th. Then we found out that there were 2 deaths in California that took place on February 6th and February 17th that were later found out to be COVID-19. President Trump at the time seemed to downplay the threat, and hopefully this video will play to give you a memory of what that looked like.
Now, the virus that we're talking about having to do, a lot of people think that goes away in April with the heat, as the heat comes in. Typically, that will go away in April. I've spoken to President Xi. They're getting it more and more under control. So I think that's a problem that's going to go away. But when you have 15 people, and the 15 within a couple of days is going to be down to close to 0, that's a pretty good job we've done. going to disappear. One day it's like a miracle, it will disappear. And from our shores, it could get worse before it gets better. It could maybe go away. We'll see what happens. You have to be calm. It'll go away. It will go away. Just stay calm. It will go away. We need a little separation until such time as this goes away. It's going to go away. It's going to go away. It will go away. You know it is going away. And it will go away. And we're going to have a great victory. It's going to go away, hopefully at the end of the month. And if not, it hopefully will be soon after that.
But so it is thinking on this evolved.
It is going away. I didn't say I said it's going away, and it is going away.
You were saying things like, I think it's a problem that's going to go away within a
Which
couple
I'm
of
right
days.
It will go away. I think what happens is it's going to go away. This is going to go away. It's going to go. It's going to leave. It's going to be gone. It's going to be eradicated. And it might take longer. It might be in smaller sections. It won't be what we had.
So probably most of us remember those days when things were looking very scary, and the president was, basically saying that things were getting better. Hold on, I'm just moving forward here. Oop, I just put up your chat. Sorry. So by March, things had really gotten very serious in the United States. And most of us remember where we were in that kind of early March, mid-March, when we were told that we had to leave our offices to go back home, that our children had to leave school, that they had to come back from the Peace Corps or from their overseas semesters abroad. Just everything changed that basically 13th of March, that Friday. That same day, President Trump declared a national emergency. He also then, a couple of weeks later, signed the CARES Act, which was the largest economic recovery package in history. That was passed by a bipartisan basis by the Congress and quickly signed into law by President Trump. So it was clear that things were very, very urgent and that immediate action needed to be taken, and the country was in an emergency. But then dial ahead to May 25th, 2020. Suddenly a whole new conversation took place. And that was around the death of George Floyd in police custody in Minneapolis. You see the very disturbing photo there that reminds us all of what happened. A Minneapolis police officer police crew was dealing with an apparent theft. They encountered George Floyd. Various things happened, and he ended up dying under the knee of the Minneapolis police officer. A video of this incident was released, immediately went viral. 4 officers were charged in the death, and the guy in the photo, the police officer Derek Chauvin, was charged with second-degree murder. That then set forth weeks and weeks of Black Lives Matter protests. You saw these all over the country, all over the world. Perhaps some of you guys participated, or some of your kids. You saw them in Pelham and around the area and around the country and around the world. It became a huge protest movement. The Black Lives Matter organization and effort had begun many, many years earlier, but was always looked at as more of a sort of a not necessarily mainstream movement. This very much changed in that time period after George Floyd's death. And it became a movement that represented, not only people in the United States, but globally, white people, people of color, young, old. It just became much more diverse and much more of a political force than it had been in the past. And around that time, President Trump sort of made a calculation that he was going to react in a way that emphasized the issues of law and order, rather than the substance of the Black Lives Matter protesters, which had to do with fairness for people of color, and specifically how they're treated by law enforcement and by folks who single them out and expose them to violence because of the color of their skin. That photo right there of President Trump is him in front of St. John's Church. That was on June 1st when there was a peaceful protest taking place in Lafayette Square in Washington. Tear gas, other types of chemicals were fired on the protesters to allow President Trump to walk from the White House over to the church and stand there and hold up the Bible. And that was a big very vivid symbol that President Trump had sort of chosen a side. And the side that he had chosen was, in his words, law and order. It was not the side of the protesters. So the combination of two, the growing problem with the pandemic and the growing Black Lives Matter movement and Black Lives Matter protests around the country, started to show President Trump's popularity beginning to diminish. And this began in June and started to sink even further. So once we got into August, it was pretty clear that his job approval was dropping because of everything that had taken place through the summer. And of course, at that point, we're getting much closer to the election. Joe Biden had essentially won the nomination, and there were a few months left for things to sort of drastically change. But there were a few major events ahead, which often can change the trajectory of a race. One is the political conventions, and the other is debates, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is what we were seeing in the summer. So in August, the party conventions, which were supposed to take place in person, the Democratic convention in Milwaukee, the Republican convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, both had to be taken mostly online. And perhaps you guys watched, they were televised across several nights separately, one after the other. The Democrats went first. And it was a study in contrast about how each side was intending to handle the threat of the virus. We saw the Democratic ticket of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. You see them here on the left. There was a lot of masks, social distancing for the guests, for the performers, for the speakers. The two of them each made their convention speeches in an empty hall. That scene is the night that they accepted the nomination, and they did do a hand clasp, but basically they kept their distance from one another and wore masks. On the right-hand side, you see President Trump and his family standing on a stage in the White House, at the White House. That's where they held the convention for the most part. There was no social distancing, there was no masks, there was a large crowd there on the lawn to greet the president and to cheer for him. So the conventions in each case were a sort of a microcosm of how each campaign in each party were approaching the threat of the virus. The Democrats considering it a serious threat, wearing masks, social distancing, taking protocols, and the President Trump and his family and the Republicans doing very little of that. Now, right about the time that the Republican convention was taking place, the sort of the whole movement around racial justice and protests converged. And that was in Kenosha, Wisconsin, when a Black man named Jacob Blake was shot in the back several times by a police officer. And he was leaning into his car with his 3 young children inside when he was shot. That then brought this explosion of violence in Kenosha. There was a lot of looting, a lot of rioting. There were things torched and burned, as you can see in the photo there. There was some violence. There was actually a couple of deaths, including when a young Trump supporter from Illinois traveled into Kenosha and shot a couple of protesters. So there was just bad violence and counter protesting going on throughout that city for several nights. President Trump, after the convention, went to Kenosha, toured the damage, that picture that you see there, and he vowed law and order would prevail, that he did not really address what happened to start this whole protest in Kenosha. He basically said that it was all unacceptable and that law and order was the only priority, and did not discuss the issue of police violence. Again, took sides. So at the end of all that, the 2 conventions, Kenosha, here you have a USA Today poll that of the very end of August, taken after the conventions, after Kenosha. You could sort of see where things stood at that point. Joe Biden running ahead of President Trump by 7 points. I think going into the conventions had been a little tighter, but we saw things get, going into the conventions, been the margin was a little wider. It tightened up as expected because basically Republicans who might have been a little hesitant about President Trump up to that point seemed to be going home, going back to the party. Plus his message around law and order, Kenosha, The protests around the country, also in Portland, Oregon, that started to take place around that time, seemed to sort of take some Republicans who up until that point might have been a little bit doubtful about President Trump, seemed to send them back his way. But then in September, the virus takes hold even more than it had at this point. We saw a lull in the summer. Some of the caseload that had been very, very high in the spring and going into the early summer, but then it dropped, came crashing back. The number of cases jumped 20% by mid-September. Nationally, we crossed the figure of 200,000 deaths. President Trump, though, decided to throw caution to the wind. He had been back in the White House for many months, hadn't really done a lot of campaign travel. He set out on the road and held 13 campaign rallies in battleground states across the country. Sometimes outdoors, but often indoors. He would gather people together in close quarters, no masks, no social distancing. Little bit smaller crowds than he got pre-COVID, but they were still quite large and certainly much larger than they should have been. President Trump and the campaign were regularly violating local rules about the size of crowds and rules that crowds had to abide by under the provisions of the public health folks in those states. And then Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, also in mid-September. President Trump was eager to change the subject from COVID and welcomed the opportunity to name a third justice to the Supreme Court. Republican leader Mitch McConnell also probably looking for another topic for his Senate to focus on other than the coronavirus, which at this point was not granting any advantage whatsoever to the Republican side of the aisle, welcomed the opportunity to hold hearings for this nomination and potentially to confirm a justice. So suddenly there looked like there was a little bit of light in the tunnel for Trump and the Republicans. But then a couple of defining events set the course for October.
Excuse me, Beth.
Yes.
Can you let people in? I can't let them
sure.
into the waiting room. Sorry.
Okay. Oh, sorry. My goodness. I meant all. Very sorry about that. I didn't realize it was in my control. Hello, everyone who's just jumped on board. Thank you for joining. We are still underway in the presentation, so you haven't missed all that much. I was just starting to talk about the events of October that have seemed to sort of take us to where we are now in the campaign. A couple of big defining events. Number one was this September 26th presentation of Amy Coney Barrett as President Trump's nominee to be the replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Hang on, I'm gonna let in a couple more people. That event was, as you can see, no masks, no social distancing, folks sitting side by side, very close. President Trump has no mask. The judge has no mask. We came to learn that she actually was diagnosed with COVID over the summer, but had recovered. Not long after this event, not only did President Trump get diagnosed with COVID, but a number of people who were at this event, including New Jersey Governor Chris Christie, 2 US senators, several of President Trump's aides in the White House, including the press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, the former communications director, Kellyanne Conway, and the immigration czar, Stephen Miller. So this was declared a super spreader event by Dr. Fauci. I'm admitting some more participants here. Then came the first presidential debate. And that many of you probably saw. It sort of devolved into chaos, a lot of shouting, a lot of interrupting, a lot of overtalk. Neither President Trump nor Vice President Biden came out looking particularly great, but there was broad consensus that it was President Trump's doing, that he had broken the rules. He had basically ignored all of the agreements that the campaign had reached with the Commission on Presidential Debates on how to conduct himself. and Vice President Biden just sort of ended up being part of all that. So even though he didn't acquit himself all that well either, it definitely, to the audience, certainly polling showed that people blamed Trump. And Chris Matthews, the moderator of the debate, went on television and said that it was the decision of the president to put this debate into this kind of mayhem, that it was much more on him than on Vice President Biden. At the same time, you saw the Trump family. I see them there on the left. They're all sitting in the hall without masks. This was after the debate commission mandated that anyone sitting inside the hall had to wear a mask. The Trump family and the other Trump guests came in wearing their masks and then removed them as they sat down and refused to put them back on, despite a doctor coming over to them and telling them that they had to put them back on. So it was a pretty strong show of defiance there by the Trump family. Hold on, I'm admitting a few more guests. So now, whoops. So now the big thing happened. President Trump was indeed diagnosed with COVID-19 on October 2nd, 3 days after that debate. We do not know when his last negative test was, so it's a fairly good chance that he was had already contracted the virus and was symptomatic and perhaps infectious during the debate in that room. But of course, as we recall, that crazy weekend after he was taken to the hospital, we saw a couple of images of him wanting very much to project an image of strength. He was taken out in his car to drive around and to greet supporters. That's the image there on the left. And then he came home and decided to sort of, in this effort to project strength, to show that he was fine, to show that he had conquered the virus, in his words, that nothing was wrong, that he was healed. He took a walk up the steps of the South Lawn to the South balcony at the White House and very dramatically removed his mask. His effort again to say, I'm here, I'm back, I'm fine, and the virus did not defeat me. So basically all this adds up to a whole heap of problems right now for President Trump, because basically his gambit around the virus has not convinced voters. He is on the wrong side of public opinion on this. And that's very much starting to drag him down nationally and in battleground states. You take a look at sort of voters' evaluation of him in a ABC News Washington Post poll that just came out on Sunday, showing that while voters approve of his handling of the economy at 54%, and his job approvals at about 45%, he's only down to 41% in voters' evaluation of his handling of the outbreak. And the subtabs within that are even worse. About 2 out of 3 voters say he did not take the necessary precautions to protect his own health. 8 out of 10 voters say they're very concerned about getting the virus, or that someone in their family is vulnerable. And really, probably the most dangerous number is over 60% of voters say they do not trust anything Trump has to say about the coronavirus. So what we've seen is that the virus has become far and away the #1 issue that voters are concerned about right now, and that Trump's approach and Trump's handling of it have been unsuccessful. So where we have it now is a pretty stable race in mid-October with Biden ahead. I say stable because a lot of these sort of major events that have taken place over the course of the last couple of months haven't really seemed to move the numbers all that much, but they've sort of settled them into a static place that is not good for the president. This is the most recent battleground map. It's an NPR map. I found others, but this is the most recent one. This is just from a few days ago. They're all pretty consistent, but this one's the most recent one that national data crunchers have put together, and that their analysts have interpreted. And what you're seeing here is a number of the states that went for President Trump in 2016, which helped him win the election. Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin are all leaning blue, meaning leaning Biden. You've got a couple of other battleground states that are a toss-up, notably Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, Ohio, and even Iowa. All of those states went very comfortably for President Trump in 2016, Iowa by a margin of almost 10 points. And then over on the West Coast, you have Arizona, which has been a very conservative red redoubt for many decades now, is leaning blue. So it is a problematic map for President Trump if he wants to get back in the game. And certainly we know that he is capable of doing that. We saw what happened in 2016. Things looked a little grim for him a few weeks out that year. And of course he came back and surprised everyone and threaded the needle and managed to win. But the next few slides I want to show you is why this isn't 2016. There's several key groups of voters that have moved away from President Trump. Senior citizens being an important subgroup. This is a group of voters that have voted for Republicans consistently, Republican presidential candidates ever since 2000. Right now, polls are finding Biden leading or tied with Trump among senior citizens. President Trump won seniors by 7 points against Hillary Clinton. This is a very large group of voters also. You guys have seen, I'm sure, the comparison to younger voters, even though numerically, let's say the millennial generation is probably as big or a little bit bigger than boomers and the silent generation. The older folks vote in much larger numbers. So they have a much bigger outsized impact on the outcome of a race. So the fact that Trump is running behind with seniors is problematic. And there's a simple reason for this. Senior citizens are most vulnerable to the coronavirus, and they're scared. They're worried about its spread, and the fact that President Trump often will go in front of crowds and say, you know what, the only people who get this thing are senior citizens. Everybody else is fine. It sounds to them that he's saying that they don't matter, and that's showing up in their preference. President Trump, has a gaping gender gap. Democrats have consistently won women voters, or at least there's been a large gender gap favoring Democrats for many decades, basically ever since Reagan. But we've never seen a gender gap of this size. The latest Washington Post ABC News poll, which is consistent with most other quality polls out there, shows Biden leading Trump by 23 points among women. That's pretty unsustainable. It's pretty hard for a candidate to win with that level of a gender gap. Just by point of comparison, Clinton won women voters by 13 in 2016. President Trump's voters, his supporters are, as we know, typically white folks without college. We're seeing an erosion of support among that group and basically among the wider white voter demographic. Among white voters without college degrees, Trump is leading Biden by 26 points. He won them by 36 points in 2016. And Biden's 31-point lead among white voters with college is double Clinton's margin with that group in 2016. So politics being what they are, many things, of course, could change the trajectory of this race between now and 3 weeks from now. Number one, Trump could persuade the Democrats and Republicans on Capitol Hill to come together to agree on a substantial financial relief measure, similar to the one that passed in the spring that I mentioned, the CARES Act. Right now, the discussion is for something to take place on Capitol Hill, probably not the size of that CARES Act, but nonetheless, a big financial infusion back into communities across the country and to unemployed people who are basically going on, months and months of no work, of places like restaurants, other small businesses unable to make payroll, to meet their mortgages because of drop in sales. These folks, these businesses have been crying out for relief from Washington for months now, after many provisions of the CARES Act ran out at the end of July. So right now there is a discussion of how to revive that, and there is a good chance that a lot of this money could go back out to folks who need it, and President Trump will probably be able to take some credit for that. There is yet one more debate coming up on October 22nd. There was supposed to be 2 more debates, and the debate that was supposed to take place this coming Thursday was canceled because it was moved to be a virtual gathering rather than a in-person debate. But the commission, after President Trump was diagnosed with COVID, decided that best to be on the safe side and not have the candidates be there in person. President Trump said he would not do that debate, that he didn't want to virtually debate, so the whole thing got canceled. So there's only one more debate. It's on October 22nd, and it could be a chance for President Trump on a very large stage with a very large audience to reassure voters that he's somebody that that they can trust. He can, do a different type of appearance than he did in the one on September 29th with Chris Wallace. He could look more presidential, he could look more statesmanlike, and he could let Joe Biden talk a little more. And the Republicans believe that Biden's kind of a shaky debater, and if he were given the opportunity to be on stage a little bit more alone or exposed, that potentially he could gaffe or make a big mistake. So the final debate could move some numbers. There could be an October surprise. There was some question for a while about whether or not a vaccine, a COVID vaccine, might be announced before the election. That looks less and less likely. Most of the major drug companies that are working on these vaccines are saying that they're not going to have it ready to go and distribute at the end of, before the November 3rd. President Trump's expressed a lot of disappointment about that, but the drug companies have been quite firm that they are not going to be pushed by any political calendar. The other October surprise that's potentially out there is the investigation within the Justice Department about the origins of the Russia probe. This is an effort led by the Connecticut Attorney General named John Durham, which, if taken to its most extreme end, could result in some legal action taken against members of the FBI or other law enforcement folks during the Obama-Biden administration with respect to the President Trump's campaign and in 2016 and the suggestion that Russia had played a role. That's all being taken apart by John Durham and could potentially be released before November 3rd. Although last week there was basically an indication by William Barr, the Attorney General, that it was probably not likely to be ready before the election. There are concerns about voting safely in a pandemic. We don't know how many people will decide to stay away from in-person voting out of concern that they could get sick at an in-person voting location. And then there's a lot of confusion around mail-in voting and whether that's safe and whether it would be handled safely and securely by all 50 states. President Trump has added to that confusion. He has alleged significant fraud among mail-in voting, although there's no evidence of that ever happening. And in fact, in the past, more Republicans than Democrats have taken advantage of mail-in voting. But nonetheless, it is something that has been become a concern largely because of folks wanting to do mail-in voting, having never done so before, not really sure how to do it, worried that their vote may not count, and the added layer of President Trump raising concerns about it. And then there's always the fact that, and we saw this in 2016, that President Trump supporters are very, very motivated. They are extremely enthusiastic about him, and they are going to vote no matter what. In poll after poll after poll, there is no question that Trump supporters are more excited about their candidate than Biden supporters. Biden supporters, for the most part, are much, much, much more motivated to vote against Trump than they are to vote for Biden. And when you have that kind of enthusiasm question, it could redound in the president's favor. We know that his supporters will crawl across broken glass to vote for him. And we don't know yet whether folks who are intending to vote for Biden have quite that level of enthusiasm. I think that's my last slide. So that's sort of where things stand right now. And I'm happy to take any questions that you guys have about this or any other aspect of the race that we're looking at.
I'm ready to read any chats. I don't see any, so I'm putting in some of my own questions here.
Yeah, I guess if anybody who's got a question, please go ahead and type it into the chat. I should have said that.
Okay, my question is, have you personally visited any states and talked to Trump supporters?
Me? Sure, of
Okay,
course.
tell us.
Haven't done too much traveling this year, though, unfortunately. Look, the Trump supporters are very, very, very enthusiastic about their candidate. There's no question about it. When you go to a Trump rally, it's kind of like nothing you've ever seen before. It's a combination of, you know, rock star, revival, big sporting event. People bring their families. It's really pretty remarkable. I mean, I've been to a ton of political rallies over the course of my career, and you've just never seen anything quite like a Trump rally. It's sort of a gathering of kindred spirits, you would almost say. People kind of relate to one another through their support for Trump, and they've sort of, it's like they're finding their tribe. So it's well beyond just supporting him as a candidate. It's sort of supporting a way of life. It's supportive of a worldview. It's supportive of a lot of sort of cultural touchstones that those folks all agree to. There's no question that they are extremely motivated and extremely enthusiastic.
Which states did you visit?
Oh, I visited many, many states. But like I say, this year I haven't gone to too many because of COVID. You see Trump supporters almost everywhere. You go to not too far outside of New York City and you start seeing a lot of Trump signs. Go up 50 miles out of here. I've been to all over Iowa, all over New Hampshire, Nevada, Florida, you name it. I mean, it depends on where you visit, obviously. Trump supporters, at least the ones who show up at rallies and do some of the big demonstrations of support, typically a little bit more rural parts of the states, typically maybe exurban, not sort of close-in suburbs, but exurbs. But certainly, you don't have to get too far out of the city, the center of a city, to start seeing a lot of Trump signs.
Okay, my second question, sorry. Do pollsters only talk to people with landline phones? If so, what about cell phone only voters?
That is a great question. It's a big problem in the world of polling, not just political polling, but, you know, I'm sure all of you guys have received calls for surveys about, you know, your shopping preferences and that kind of thing. Fewer and fewer people have landline phones. Certainly most people under the age of 35 don't even own a landline phone. People who do own landline phones tend not to pick them up. That is certainly true among folks who typically are sort of distrustful of political polling, which generally translates into conservative people or Republicans, which in part was why some of the battleground polling in 2016 was considered to be off, that they just did not end up interviewing enough conservative voters. And part of that was a distrust of picking up the phone, talking to pollsters, sort of agreeing to the whole process. A lot of pollsters, that's a whole sort of separate issue, is kind of trust of even participating in those surveys. But on the issue of cell phones versus landlines, more and more reputable polling companies are switching to cell phone only, or vast majority cell phone polling. So they are making the adjustment, but there's been a kind of rough transition. There's also a lot of online polling that's starting to emerge, and it's still very iffy. Some of the online polling that we're seeing is a little bit better than others, but there's a lot of pretty sketchy online polling. So when you see a poll about basically any topic that you're interested in, check out the methodology. And if it looks like it's an online only poll, just keep that in mind, that those are not as reliable as phone samples.
What does NBC do?
We do phone.
phone.
Yeah.
All right, I'll read someone else's here. Can you give an estimate of when the election results will be called?
Oh, yeah, that's a big question on a lot of people's minds. And here's why. Because of the volume of mail-in voting that is taking place all over the country, many states that are accepting this, mail-in voting for the first time are completely unprepared for counting and managing the volume of mail-in votes. We even saw that here in New York in the primary in June. Remember, some of those primary results took 2 weeks to be called, and that was because so many people had mailed in their ballot, and the Board of Elections all over the states just had no experience doing that level of counting. So it's possible that in some states, including some battleground states, it's going to take a while for mail-in ballots to be counted. And there's a real question of what that's going to look like, because typically, everybody gathers in front of their TV on the night of the election, and they want to see states being called and that a winner being called. And there is a possibility that this year that's not going to happen, simply because we are all voting under COVID, and it's a different experience. So what I think is going to end up happening is news organizations are very much going to have to signal this well in advance, and boards of elections in states across the country are going to have to signal this well in advance, that it might take a little longer to count votes, and that people need to be patient and just wait, because a vote that comes in by mail is every bit as legitimate as somebody who comes in and votes in person. And it's going to take some states a little bit of extra time. And it's an unprecedented situation. We've really never gone through this, something quite like this before, but hopefully people will respond in a mature way and just let the counts get done.
Any thoughts on the huge lines in the early voting states? And are there any stats on Democrats succeeding in registering more new voters versus Republicans?
I think that varies from state to state. My reaction to the long lines is, in some ways, it's a good thing. It shows a lot of enthusiasm. People are really excited to vote this year, and they're going out and they're willing to stand in lines and do so. But of course, it does also suggest some problems that are out there that are more systemic. Number one, there just seems to be a much bigger problem in communities of color, of folks having to wait in longer lines. And whether that's deliberate or not, it's unclear, but it does seem that many of the polling locations in minority communities have been collapsed, so that folks used to have many places to go vote, and now there may be only one or two in their community or in their county. So that requires waiting in long lines. There's always questions of malfunctioning voter equipment. We've seen that in a number of states. That happened in Georgia during the primary. There, folks ended up waiting in lines like 7, 8, 9 hours. And it was a combination of crowds and just malfunction of voting machines. None of this is good. I mean, we are the most important country in the world. We should not have these types of glitches for voting when, obviously these places have, months and years to prepare, that these machines should not be breaking down. But on the occasion where it's deliberate, where election officials are seemingly making it harder for people to vote in certain places, that's obviously not good for anybody. The voting should be as readily accessible in a wealthier or whiter part of a state as it is in an environment of color, and we are just seeing that there's major discrepancies.
Are there less undecided voters this year compared to 2016?
It does appear that way. It does appear that there are far fewer undecided voters this time, and there's a couple of other variables that from last time that we're not seeing this time. Number one, there were 2 third-party candidates in 2016, Johnson and Stein, who took a pretty significant chunk of the vote in a lot of battleground states. There's nobody who has that kind of stature running as a third-party candidate this time. So that's not as much of a factor. And number two, as the questioner asked, there's not as many undecided voters. So what really comes down to is which side who has all these decided voters are going to see their folks show up in the larger numbers. It's really a contest between two sides that are very motivated.
Who do you think will win?
Hello?
Steve, okay. All right. This is from someone who drove from Pelham to southern Vermont this past weekend on New York Route 20 and was surprised that there were so many Biden signs and not so many Trump signs. So that
well, that's interesting. There's always a lot of fascination with signs. And in 2016, there were a lot more Trump signs out in the world than there were Clinton signs. And the sort of, sophisticated political observers were always want to say, signs don't really tell you anything. They're ways for people to show their support, but they don't indicate that, just because a house doesn't have a sign on it doesn't mean that that family or that couple or what have you they're just as motivated to vote. They just don't have a sign. But in retrospect, it's a good proxy for enthusiasm. And in 2016, Trump voters were just much, much, much more enthusiastic about their candidate than Hillary Clinton voters were. And that was made evident by signs. There is a lot of anecdotal evidence that the questioner raises and that a lot of people are talking about, that we're seeing a much bigger parity of signs across the country than in 2016. There's certainly a ton of Trump signs, but there actually are a lot of Biden signs, much more than Clinton signs in 2016.
All right. Bart Gellman wrote an apocalyptic piece about the post-election mayhem. Can you comment? Was that overblown or possible? It was in the Atlantic, and the link is on the chat here if people want to get to it.
Yeah, I've certainly read it. I don't, not everybody in this call, in this Zoom has read it, so I'll just kind of paraphrase. Bart Gellman was describing a scenario that the race becomes very close to call across battleground states, and that President Trump, being the incumbent and with having the tools of the federal government at his disposal, could basically just grab the race and win it based on his ability to command the resources of the federal government, the Justice Department, lawsuits. There was even a scenario, the Republican chairman of the state of Pennsylvania, which of course is a battleground state, said on the record in that story that he had been in touch with the Trump campaign about the possibility of throwing out the Democratic vote and instead installing a slate of electors that the state legislature could do. And while that is all constitutionally possible, it's not illegal. It's never been done before. It's never been used. But he suggests this guy suggested that it was actively under consideration by the Trump campaign if the race was close. So I guess I'm of two minds of it. I think on the one hand, sure, that's certainly a possibility. I mean, we've seen a whole lot of things transpire in this year and over the last several years that probably none of us could believe were going to happen, that have happened. So I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that what this article described could happen. On the other hand, it sort of presupposes another one of those, super, super, super too close to call elections. And it may not be that close. It may be much more evident that one side or the other has clearly won. And in that case, it's going to be very hard for President Trump to take that kind of action. So I would just read the article. It's very interesting. It's very well reported, but it's just one scenario that could take place. It's by no means assured.
Okay, radical Islamic terrorism was a major topic for discussion 4 years ago. Now it is not even mentioned. Is that a credit to this administration and its continued vigilance against terrorism?
Well, there haven't been any terrorist attacks in several years. Islamic terrorist attacks, that's true. And it probably does credit the administration for its safeguards and its intelligence gathering and its deployment of folks to protect us. On the other hand, we've seen a whole lot of other types of terrorism in this country. We just saw 13 men arrested last week plotting the kidnapping and murder of the governor of Michigan. That's a form of terrorism. They're not Muslim, but it's certainly a form of terrorism. We've seen a big spike in white supremacist attacks. The FBI director, Chris Wray, who President Trump personally named, said that white supremacy and domestic terror is the #1 terror threat to this country, much eclipsing Muslim terror. So we're just in a different phase of who's presenting a danger to us at this moment.
All right, here's another Atlantic article on scary epic. Anne Applebaum wrote an Atlantic piece about her experience in Eastern Europe a few years ago, making something of a dire prediction about the future of democracy. She said democracy is an idea that people believe in until they don't, as in Eastern Europe. Is she crazy?
You know, I'm not somebody who's a scholar of international movement, so I'm not the best person to answer that question. I mean, look, we've seen certainly a number of countries in the last 5 years flirt with authoritarianism. Certainly in East Europe, Hungary, Poland, the Philippines, Turkey. There is no question that President Trump and his administration have moved to sort of break through some democratic norms. I would argue that our country, our systems are much more durable than the rest of the world or most of the rest of the world, and that they can withstand these types of challenges. But I would agree that, you know, democracy only exists insofar as people are willing to endorse it and defend it and practice it. And as long as that's the case, our institutions will stand. If there is a sort of unrelenting assault upon them, then they become vulnerable. But my bet is on the institutions of this country. They've been pretty durable for 250 years, and hopefully they will continue to be so.
Do you feel the Democrat primary contestants are doing their part in supporting Biden-Harris ticket, or are they intentionally quiet because some may be feared as socialists?
So that's a great question, because, you know, you definitely saw there's so much energy on the left side of the Democratic Party. And so the fact that kind of the most moderate of the major candidates ended up winning might have been a little surprise to folks who were active left-leaning types. Probably a lot of our kids would fall into that camp. Look, Bernie Sanders has been doing a lot of campaigning for Biden, much more so than he did for Hillary Clinton. You know, this whole year is so weird. Like, people can't go out on the road and do these big rallies. I mean, Bernie Sanders used to have, you know, gigantic rallies. He can't do that anymore. It's unsafe. But he's been doing a lot of virtual campaigning. He's been talking to activist groups who supported him. The Bernie Sanders campaign worked with the Biden campaign on a number of their issue policy agenda, including on energy. The Sunshine Movement, which is this big mass activist group of young voters, young, you know, kids essentially, who are very interested in climate change, have endorsed Biden, and that was probably thanks to a prompt from Bernie Sanders and AOC. We've seen others in the primary field helping out as well. Pete Buttigieg, for example, helped Kamala Harris prepare for her debate. He played Mike Pence. He role-played Mike Pence for her in her prep. He's also been going on Fox News a lot. He's become a big Biden surrogate on Fox News. He seems very comfortable going on there and making the case for Biden, which seems really smart to me, to have somebody taking their case to that audience. So yeah, I mean, Elizabeth Warren's been raising money. Amy Klobuchar's been raising money. They've all been active in their way. We just haven't seen it so visibly because nobody's out campaigning the way they normally would in a normal year.
And then somebody says, I get fundraising requests from all of them.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of people will probably say that, particularly this time of year. Listen, the money that's being raised is amazing. The Democratic group Act Blue, which is kind of a clearinghouse for Democratic candidates, has raised something like $2 billion. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. The candidate who's running against Lindsey Graham in South Carolina, Senator Lindsey Graham, just raised $57 million in the third quarter. Not for the whole race, for the third quarter. I mean, that's unheard of. I mean, that's presidential level fundraising for just one relatively small state. So if money were going to make the difference in this race, the Democrats would clean up. But of course, money isn't the only factor.
Well, let's parse this first here. What is going to be the biggest surprise in the Senate contest?
Oh, I'm out of the prediction business. I don't want to make any predictions specifically on the Senate. The Democrats need to net 4 seats to pick up control of the Senate. It is certainly possible for them to do, but it is not guaranteed. They are challenged. They don't have to defend too many seats, but they have to defend a couple. Plus, they need to pick up that many more. So I think it's certainly a possibility that Democrats could win the Senate, but it's not 100% guaranteed.
And what will you be doing on election night? Are you working?
I'll certainly be working. I don't know what I'll be doing because we're in the Zoom situation this year. Normally, I would either be out on the road with a candidate or I would be in the control room at NBC, and I'm going to be neither place, but I'm sure I will have assignments and responsibilities that night that will involve sitting in front of my computer, just like right now. But it's going to be an exciting night, and I hope you all vote, and I hope you all, are plugged in and engaged. Obviously, you are, because you wanted to come listen to this talk. But it's really important. It's really important for people to participate, particularly in a year like this where there's a lot of challenges to participation. And I hope it doesn't throw too many people off, and that people, take their vote seriously and take the franchise seriously and figure out the way to vote that they're most comfortable with. We're lucky in New York. We can vote in person. On the day of the election, we can do early in person, and we could vote by mail. So, everybody should, figure it out and get out there and celebrate democracy.
There's already a question here if there's any Pelham election parties that are socially distanced and like-minded. I think you'll have to talk among yourselves about that. I do want to note that people in Pelham can vote early in New Rochelle, and the voting location is behind City Hall, and you have to find a parking place behind City Hall. But I've been surprised that people in Pelham don't realize that they can vote early by going to New Rochelle. The voting records are electronic, so they will have all of your information there. So come to New Rochelle. I happen to live in New Rochelle now.
Yeah, early voting starts October 24th in New York. Early in person.
Early in person, right. And there is a note here that anyone who is a Pelham Democrat, they are gathering next Sunday at 4 p.m., but you'll have to talk to the Democrats about that. And there are multiple early voting locations in Westchester. Well, thank you very much, Beth. We really appreciate you coming to be with us tonight. And I want to thank everyone who joined us for this Manor Club Zoom meeting. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks to all of you for attending.
Thank you.